Nice to see everyone again. Those of you who I can actually see with your cameras on. Those of you who are hiding behind your cameras, nice to have you with us nonetheless. Okay, let me just get one thing ready and we will go. Okay. Okay, Chaim, let's do it. Parsha Shemot. We actually begin, of course, the new Sefer of Sefer Shemot, and the Torah that I'd like to share with you tonight from the Rosh Yeshiva, mostly from the Rosh Yeshiva. I say 90% of it is all based on his Torah. Is a fascinating weaving of different concepts into the idea of Shemot, the idea of a shame, the idea of a name, which is one that's often spoken about, particularly, of course, in this week's Parsha as we begin the Sefer Shemot. Let's begin right from the beginning of the Sefer on the top of your sheet. Ve'ele Shmos b'nei Yisrael haboim Mitzrayim. The Torah begins this Sefer of Shmos with, these are the names. That's where the book, of course, gets its name from. The names of b'nei Yisrael who came to Mitzrayim, literally haboim Mitzrayim means coming in the present tense, which we'll speak about in a few moments. Yaakov, together with Yaakov, ish uve, so bo, each person, each man together with his household. And then the Torah lists the names of the Shvatim, which is what troubles all of the Mefarshim and the Midrashim, which will be the topic of our discussion tonight. We already know the names, and yet here the Torah gives us the names of Bnei Yisrael that came down to Mitzrayim. Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar, Zvulun, Binyamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher. We're told who it was that came down. Vayukol Nefesh, Yotzei Yerech, Yaakov, Shivim Nefesh, and the sum total was 70. Yosef Hayab in Mitzrayim. Yosef was in Mitzrayim. Rashi addresses that issue. Why we need that? Not for us tonight. Vayomat Yosef v'kol echav v'chol hador hahu. And then the Torah concludes its introductory paragraph by telling us Yosef died, all of his brothers died, the entire generation dies, and yet Bnei Yisrael are paru v'yishritzu. They increase, they multiply, and they fill the entire earth. And what we're going to be addressing is what the Medrash is bothered by, Rashi, the Ramban. We'll see all of them in a moment. The need for the Torah to list the names of, this is information which we have. We were actually told not just when they were born, not are we just told about their whole story, which we've learned about in the end of Sefer Bereshis. The Torah then listed the 70 souls who came down to Mitzrayim at the end of Sefer Bereshis. We were actually told that. So the Medrash picks up in source number 1, Ve'ele Shmos b'nei Yisrael, picking up on this first pasuk, Shkulim Yisrael kitzvo hashomayim. Klal Yisrael is compared, similar, equal to the legions of the heavens, meaning the stars, the, like, so to speak, almost the army of Hashem up in the heavens, all of the stars. The Klal Yisrael is compared, equal to these stars. Ne'emar kan Shemot, just like it says here in the beginning of our parsha, referring to the children of Yisrael, their names, V'nemar bekochavim Shemot. And we also have that same word of Shemot referring to the stars. Where do we see that? We say it in davening every morning. Shene'emar monem mispar lakochavim, that Hashem counts by number the stars. L'chulam shemos yikra. Not only does he count the stars, but he gives them each a name. And in the same way as we see this word shemot yikra when it comes to the stars, we see that in the beginning of our parsha. Eile shmos b'nei Yisrael. So the Medrash concludes, Af HaKadosh Baruch Hu kishi yardu Yisrael in Mitzrayim. So too Hashem, when the Jewish people went down to Mitzrayim, mana misparam kamahayu. We counted their numbers. How many are there? We got the number, just like the stars. There was a total number of 70. But because it's more than just a number, because we're compared to the stars, kara shemos l'chulam. Each one is given a name, so picks up the Medrash on the opening word of our parsha, the name of our whole book, Shmos. We're given a name because we're compared to the stars. Now, this idea of being compared to stars is an old idea. We actually see this when Avram fulfills the Akedah, when he brings his son Yitzchak as a korban, and the Malach calls out to him and stops him. The Malach, the second Malach, which calls out to Hashem at the Akedah, says to him, I see what you've done, and therefore gives him the following bracha in source number 2, Ki varecha varechacha, I will surely bless you, v'hirba arbe zaracha, I will increase your children, k'kochvei hashamayim, v'kachoyol asher al sfas hayam, like the stars in the heavens and the sand on the sea. Now, the Rosh Yeshiva pointed out there are different ways, there are different methods in which we count things. Two primary ways or reasons, or almost you would say agendas, why you count something. Certain things that are counted strictly to know the sum total. If you think of a classic bar mitzvah boy counting up the money after his big day, so he's counting it all. He doesn't really care how many 20s he got and how many 50s and how many hundreds. The denominations don't matter. The only thing that he's interested in is what's the sum total of the money that I have. That's the goal of counting the money. What's here? There are other types of counts, not like counting money. If you were a diamond dealer, for example, and you were counting your jewelry, there it's not a matter of how many diamonds do I have in front of me, because that's not going to tell you the information that you need. I need to know each and every single diamond, what's its value, what's its nature, what's this one about, what's that one about. So a sum total doesn't tell me what I'm looking for. I need to know everything about each individual one. And the Jewish people are given two different blessings, which started with Avram. We're given a blessing to be like the stars in the heaven, and we're given a blessing to be like the sand on the sea, and they represent two different types of blessing. Sand would never be counted individually. It doesn't make sense to count it individually. It has no value as an individual grain of sand. Its value is only in the sum total of its number. When you have a multitude of sand, it becomes valuable. You can do something with it. It's a beach, make a sand castle, a sandbag. A grain of sand is meaningless. And therefore it would make no sense to give a name to a grain of sand. It's just boggling. Why would you do that? How could you do that? For what purpose would you give it a name? Because it doesn't have any value to be individualized like that. Stars represent the exact opposite. The blessing of sand is just in numbers. A star is l'chulam Shemot yikra. Every star gets a name. It makes sense to give a name to something which has an intrinsic independent value. A star, they might seem small to us. It's a world unto itself. We know that. Not just that Hashem gives a name to every star, the astronomers give a name to every star. Every single star is identified by a specific name or number that this is this one as opposed to that one. You never would do that for sand, but we're given two separate brachas to describe the different points in time in history almost. If the Jews are doing what we're supposed to be doing, we're like stars. If not, we could be like the sand. And to be given a name represents it's a unique, every single one has its quality, has his or her value that we add, and therefore is entitled to a name. And we see the Eila Shmos, B'nai Yisrael, the Medrash says, as we go down to Mitzrayim, we're given a name. Now, Rashi adds to this in the famous first Rashi of our Parsha. He points out in the same question that we've been addressing, even though we've already been counted in source 3, Rashi says they were counted during their lifetime when they actually went down to Mitzrayim. They're counted again here after all of the brothers have died. And so Rashi's language is this idea of giving a name to everything shows love. It shows the care that Hashem has for each and every one. Rashi borrows this idea from the Medrash. We're compared to the stars, that each one is taken out not just with a number, but with a name. Census, for example, counts people, but it only counts numbers. Being reduced to a number takes away from the love, the way that we're cared for. We all know I have to go into from the Holocaust, but when a person is reduced to a number, that's you lose everything. So Hashem counts us with names to signify the love that he has. And so Rashi says that's why the Sefer opens with information that we know already, their names. It's not conveying information about their names, it's conveying information about the relationship that Hashem has by giving them each a name and counting them by name. That's the famous first Rashi on our Parsha based on this Medrash. The question that we need to address is, why now? Meaning this idea that Hashem values each one of the members of Klal Yisrael, each one of the 12 Shvatim, compares us to stars and gives each one a name to say, you're not just a number, you're a name. There's something represented in that, not a grain of sand, but a star. Beautiful idea. But the Medrash, which I brought in source number 1 and underlined, Afa Kadosh Baruch Hu Kishiyardu Yisrael Mitzrayim Mana Misparim Kama. When they went down to Mitzrayim, he counted their names, and counted their numbers and gave them a name. Why now? Why is this lesson of getting a special name, the love of the name specific to going down to Mitzrayim, that we're taught this, which is really an idea that could have been taught at any point, that Hashem loves us and gives us names. And that's what I'd like to weave together, as Rosh Yeshiva really does, a second idea, which is the Ramban's approach to the same problem of why are we told Eila Shmos now when it's information we already know. The Ramban addresses this as well in his introduction to Sefer Shmos, and that is in source number 4. The Ramban says as follows. He really addresses a different question. The Ramban asks, sorry, just having trouble getting that in front of me where I want it. The Ramban addresses the question of why do we have separate books anyway? What's the value of a Sefer Breshis, Sefer Shmos, Sefer Vayikra? We'll just keep them all together. Why do we have to subdivide them into Svarim, which we know the Chumash does, because when you write a Sefer Torah, you have to leave 4 lines blank in between the end of Sefer Breshis to the beginning of Sefer Shmos to designate this is a new book. Okay, it's a new book. Why do we need 5 books? What's the difference between this one and that one? So the Ramban says there's actually different themes that run through each Sefer. So he begins Sefer Breshis is the Sefer HaYitzira. It's in the Tas Sefer source number 4. The book of creation. It's the creation of the world. It's the creation of all things that exist in the world. And it's the creation, he writes, of the Jewish people themselves. The Yitzira of Klal Yisrael. I'm struggling here with my source. I can't get the source that I want, but all right, we'll leave it as it is. It's the creation of Klal Yisrael. As literally as we go through Sefer Breshis, all the things that happen to the Avos are forming, creating what we become as Klal Yisrael, and all the things that are going to happen to them. And then we get to Sefer Shmos, says the Ramban. That's underlined here in source 4. V'nis yachet Sefer ve'ela Shmos. What is this Sefer of Shmos? Be'inyan hagolus harishon hanigzor beferish. That is the exile. When Hashem told Avram Avinu, Ki ger yezarecha ba'aretz lo lehem, your children will become strangers in a land that's not theirs. This is that. This is the exile, uvegeula mimenu, and redemption from that. So that this is the book of exile and redemption. And the significance of that is and that's why the Torah begins with, and these are the names of Klal Yisrael that came down. Reuben, Shimon. Don't we know that name that already? We know that information. So Rashi answered it to tell us how beloved they are. The Ramban says, no, even though it was already written, when we went down to Mitzrayim, when the brothers went down to Mitzrayim, that began Golus. That began exile. They were no longer in the home that was theirs, and therefore the book of exile begins by going back to a part of the story, even though that part of the story had technically already been told to us. We know that, but the first time it was told to us in the context of Yitzira, of forming a nation. Now it's being told to us in the context of Golus, of exile, and the exile began when the brothers went down to Mitzrayim. The Ramban goes on to explain, and that's why Sefer Shmos ends with the building of the Mishkan and Hashem's presence filling it. Because even though we left Mitzrayim halfway through the book, we leave Mitzrayim in Parshas B'Shalach, we receive the Torah in Parshas Yisro, that's not redemption. Redemption is when the Shechina dwells amongst the Jewish people in the Mishkan, and we return, he writes, to Ma'alos Avosam, to this eminence of the fathers who were the chariots of Hashem's presence in this world. When we achieve that, that's full and complete redemption, and therefore the book ends by Yimalei Hashem b'kvod anon. When Hashem's presence fills the Mishkan, that's the end of the book, because now we've achieved redemption. We started Ve'ela Shmos. Here are the names of those who went down to Mitzrayim, beginning exile, and we end redemption of the filling of the Mishkan. Parenthetically, that idea that the Ramban expresses that full redemption is achieved only when Hashem's presence dwells within us is very relevant in today's day and age, where the Jews have returned. We've returned to the modern state of Israel. Nearly half of the world Jewish population is back in the land of Israel. We have an army, we have a state, we have a currency, we have a stock market, we have all of these things. Have we achieved redemption? So there's a lot of talk about this, but the Ramban would say you could be back in the land, but until you have the Shechina, which in our case will be the rebuilding of the third Beis HaMikdash and the presence of the Beis HaMikdash being filled by Hashem's presence dwelling within us, that is full and complete redemption. We could be moving towards that, but until we achieve that, we have not yet achieved our full redemption. Be that as it may, the Ramban addresses us, introduces us now to this new concept that the reason why we begin with the names and the purpose of this book is it's an idea of exile. Now that is rooted in a medrash. In source number 5, the medrash says on the phrase Haba'im Mitzrayim, here are the names of those who came down to Mitzrayim. So that language means in the present tense, Haba'im, they're coming now to Mitzrayim. The medrash asks, V'chi hayom ba'im. But this is an old story. All the brothers have died already, as the pasuk itself says. Why do you use the language of these are the names of those who are coming to Mitzrayim? It should have said these are the names of those who came. So the Medrash says, "Ela kol zman she Yosef hayakayim." As long as Yosef was alive, lo haya lehem masoi shel Mitzrim. They did not have the burden of servitude of the Egyptians as long as Yosef was alive. Meis Yosef, but once Yosef dies, Nasnu aleim masoi. Then the servitude, the burden of Mitzrayim comes upon them. Therefore, the pasuk says, "Haba'im." They're coming now. Ki ilu oso hayom nichnesu leMitzrayim. When the brothers get there, and now that everybody has died, it's literally as we begin this book, it's like now they got to Mitzrayim, because now the servitude is going to begin as Yosef has already died. And that's the purpose of why we start with the names as everybody is coming. This idea of exile is a fundamental idea that we don't only see here in Sefer Shemot, as the Ramban has told us. It extends way beyond just Sefer Shemot. It's an idea which appears in the Chumash itself, in the very beginning of Chumash, weaving its way through all of Jewish history. The very second pasuk in all of Chumash, V'ha'aretz, in source 6, V'ha'aretz ha'isdasohu v'avo, v'choshech al pnei tehom. The world was astonishingly void or chaotic, tohu v'avo. It was dark on the face of the depth, and the Ruach Elokim was hovering al pnei hamayim. So the Medrash says, on the top of it's on the top of my sheet here, number 7. Rabbi Shimon Melakish pasuk kirya begolios. Rabbi Shimon Melakish understood this pasuk, the words tohu, vohu, choshech, tahom, void, chaotic, dark, and in the great depths, as a reference to the 4 exiles that the Jewish people historically are going to go through. Not in Mitzrayim. This is the 4 exiles after we arrive in the land of Israel, after we build the Beis HaMikdash. 4 exiles that we're going to go through are rooted in this very second pasuk in all of Chumash. And the Medrash goes through each one of the words, how this word reflects one of the exiles. The first phrase of the word was chaotic or void. Tohu is Bavel. Vohu is Madai. Choshech is a reference to Yavan, the Greek exile. And Al Pnei Tehom is the Golus of the Mamlachas Harisha, the Edom, the Roman exile, which we're in right now. She'ein lem cheker, it's called Pnei Tehom, the depth, because there's no end to this exile. And the Ruach Elokim Mirachefes, the end of the pasuk, that the Spirit of Hashem will hover. Zeh Rucho Shel Melech HaMashiach. After we go through these 4 exiles, and we're at the end of the 4th exile, the interminable, this endless 4th exile in the great depth of the Roman Western exile. After that, then Hashem's presence will hover over the world, and that will be the Rucho Shel Melech HaMashiach. Why is it that exile is embedded into the nature of creation? In the very beginning of creation, we have this idea of these 4 exiles that the Jewish people are going to go through, and finally the redemption of the Ruach Elokim. But it's not as if the fact that it's here in the very second pasuk in the creation of all of the world, it's not just as if, it happens to be that we were exiled. It's as if it's a part of creation that there are going to be these 4 stops in the various exiles, which only through those stops, each station that you have to go through, then you'll eventually get to the Rucho Shel Melech HaMashiach, the creation or the bringing of Mashiach and the full redemption of the Jewish people. This idea is a complicated, you're just going to really scratch the surface of it, but there are a number of midrashim which address this issue, the way to relate to exile. The Medrash in source number 8, for example, on our Parsha, the Eilish Shmos B'nai Yisrael, again referring to this first pasuk of here are the names of the Jewish people that came down to Mitzrayim. The Medrash connects that pasuk to a seemingly completely unrelated pasuk. The pasuk again in the beginning of Sefer Shmos says, here are the names of the Jewish people who came down to Mitzrayim. Says the Medrash, this is related to a pasuk in Mishlei about raising your children. Says the pasuk in Mishlei, Choshech Shivto Sone Bino. One who chosech, who puts away, hides his rod. A rod represents the staff that you would use to strike someone. If you put away your rod, you hate your son. Ve'oihavo, but if you love him, shicharo musar, you'll make sure to fill him with rebuke. That's the pasuk in Shlomo HaMelech in Mishlei. If you put away your rod, you hate your son. If you love him, you'll rebuke him all the time. So the Medrash says, what's this a reference to? Normally, if a person would say to someone else, you know, that guy is beating up your son, you would drop everything to attack the person who's striking your son. But what Shlomo Melech teaches, yes, that's when someone else is hitting your son. You'll never stand for that. You'll do everything to stop that person. But when Shlomo Melech says, but if you put away your own rod, you hate your son, that's lilamdecha, that's to teach you, yeah, protect your son from someone else. But bekol hamonea beno min hamardos, but if you don't strike him, sofba l'tarbus ra'a visono, meaning not physically strike him. If you don't rebuke him and make sure that he's on the straight and narrow path, in the end, he's going to leave you. He'll leave the righteous path, enter into an evil company, and will hate you. So that the only way to make sure that he doesn't hate you is by using the rod of rebuke, of musar. You have to point things out that this is not the way that things should be done. The Medrash then gives a number of examples. We find by Yishmael, the Medrash speaks at length, Avraham never rebukes Yishmael, and he ends up going off. Similarly, Vayev Yitzchak as Esav. Yitzchak loved Esav so much he never rebukes him, and therefore, he never rebuked him, he left. David never gave rebuke to son Avshalom. Avshalom rebels against his own father and tries to overthrow him. Medrash gives another example, a number of examples that Medrash gives. However, if you love your son, you will give him rebuke. That's in English. Where do you see that? That is Hashem himself. Al she'ohav es Yisrael shehu marbe osan b'yisurin. He loves the Jewish people so much, he gives us yisurin, he gives us tsaras, he gives us difficulties, he gives us rebuke. Then the Medrash concludes, this is a very complicated Medrash, we're not going to be able to address in all of its elements, but let's try. Shalosh matanos tovos. There are three gifts, three great gifts. Nasan HaKadosh Baruch Hu liYisrael. Three gifts that Hashem gave us. Torah, Eretz Yisrael, and Olam Haba. Three greatest gifts that we can have. Torah in our lifetime, to be able to live, learn, fulfill Torah, to have the gift of Eretz Yisrael, and eternity of Olam Haba. Says the Medrash, V'chulam lo nitnam lahem ela al yidei yisurin. But those three are only given through you. You cannot achieve them without yisurin, without difficulties, without rebuke, without pain, without suffering. Nothing valuable comes without a cost. It just doesn't work. You can't become strong if you don't lift weights. And if you lift weights, it's going to hurt, because the only way to build muscle, every time you lift a weight, you're literally breaking down the muscle that's there now, and then it rebuilds itself stronger. That's literally the process that happens, which is why that's the classic example. No pain, no gain. It's true, because if there's no pain of the muscle stretching, pushing, breaking itself down to build itself back up, you won't get any stronger. So these three great gifts, as the Medrash, Torah, Eretz Yisrael, and Olam Haba, can only be achieved through Yisur. Now, this Medrash requires a lot of discussion, but what do we have here? If you don't rebuke a child, if you let a child do whatever the child wants, and the parent says, I love my child so much, I don't want to hurt him, I don't want to offend him. So as the Medrash points out, which we all know this from our own experiences, it's beautiful that you love your child so much, But if you never point out when a child is a child. A child needs to learn right from wrong. A child needs to be shaped. It's the same idea. This is the Hasidic idea, by the way, of the upsharing, where we let a child's hair grow for the first 3 years without being, a child is not yet ready for anything. So we just let it grow wild. And then at a certain point, you need to trim, you need to cut, you need to shape. You can't let a field grow wild. It doesn't produce. It has to be managed. And to manage, you sometimes need to prune in order that something grows well. You need to cut things back. You need to shape. And that's part of the process of it. It's not a simple process. And we all also know from experiences, the relationship between a parent and a child is fundamentally different from the child to the grandparents. And there's a very obvious, many reasons for that. But the most basic reason for that is that the parent has the responsibility of raising the child. The parent has the responsibility, go to bed. You can't eat that. You have to do your work. You know, all the things that go on. The parent is the one who teaches the child to drive, which is just a disaster. All the things that go on about that stuff. The grandparent just gets to spoil the child. Now the child's getting what it needs, hopefully in the right, everything is done correct by the parent. So that dynamic has the dynamic that it has, which is the natural dynamic between a parent and a child. The grandparent dynamic doesn't usually have that. It's all fun and games. It's all sweet. It's lovely. But as the Medrash points out, it's a requirement. If you love your child, you have to rebuke. You have to. You will suffer the consequences if you don't. Now, what the Medrash does is it says, and who's the greatest lover of us? Ribono Shel Olam himself loves us. And he loves us so much that the gifts that he wants to give us, they all come with a form of Yisurin. Now, this concept, which is still complex, so why does he have to give us a gift with Yisurin? I want to share a Sfas Emes. Sfas Emes was the second Ger Rebbe from the Hasidim of Ger, who was the grandson of the Chidush, and the Sfas Emes' father died very, very young. He was actually raised by his grandfather, which there's a lot of elements about that. He talks about that a lot, and about the idea that we just spoke about, the different type of relationship when a grandfather has to play the father's role. It's just a whole different dynamic. But in any case, Sfas Emes writes as follows on our Parsha. Uve emes hagolus, this idea of exile. Again, before I read this Sfas Emes, the Medrash which just spoke about the need to rebuke, and how when Avram did not rebuke Yishmael, and Yitzchak did not rebuke Esav, and David did not rebuke his son Avshalom, how they all rebelled against them. What was the pasuk in our Chumash that the Medrash is saying is a reflection of this idea of Sefer Mishlei? Ve'ela Shmos B'nei Yisrael. The Medrash started in source number 8 again. It started with our pasuk. Here are the names of the Jewish people going down to Mitzrayim. Oh, that's the idea of rebuke. This is again the Ramban's approach of, because when we went down to Mitzrayim, that's Golus. That's the beginning of exile. And when we go down to exile, it's a form of love that Hashem has for us. How so? How is that a form of love? Says this Sfas Emes. Uve emes hagolus hulahotzi koach haneshamas el hapalel. What Golus does, what exile does, is it brings out the latent power, the source, the traits of the neshama into actualization. Every neshama, our goal in this world is to bring out all of our abilities into actualization, not to have them latent within us. Our purpose in this world is to bring them out. Vayidei hagolus, and it's exile. Mishtanos kochos haneshama ba'ofanim shanim. Person's in their home environment. It's nice, it's quiet, it's comfortable, everything is good. In that environment, it's rare that a person can flourish because it's so nice, it's comfortable, I'm home, I like it here, I have no pressure, I'm not forced to do anything. When you get exiled from your home, it forces the soul to reach deep down into itself, to bring out that which it needs to thrive and to survive. V'lechein shoresh shem golus, the root of the word golus, exile, me'inyan hisgalus, which means to reveal. Golus is a gilui, it's a revelation. Through the golus process, the person himself becomes revealed. Like a wave. That a person is switched through his trials and tribulations and the exile that he's in, Everything that he's able to do is brought out through that. And the Sfas Emes concludes, you say this is a tremendous, so going into Galus has a certain elevation to it in that you become, it's a process of binyan. Of course, the Galus also is a result of sin and chait, not minimizing it, the Sfas Emes doesn't either. But through that process, it's not just, oh, you were bad, you did something wrong, get out of here. No. It's by getting out of here, you will grow, fix, remedy, develop that which you need to come back. And that's why he adds ve'ele shmos. Our sefer begins with a vav. Ve'ele shmos. It's a strange way to start a book with a vav. And these are the names. So Chazal say Mosif al Harishonim. It's adding onto the first time we named them. So the Sfas Emes in his Hasidic way says, Ki davka al yidei hagolus. Yes, we knew their names in Bereshis, but now that we're describing their names as they go into exile, Nisgadlu v'Nisbaru, they become bigger, greater, and they clarify their names. The Tosefes Merubel Hashlemus, they become clear. We're adding to who they were in Bereshis. Now through the exile process, they're going to become even more. Just to add a word of explanation, what the Sfas Emes is saying, just 2 points. Number one, we all know, just as an example, in the 40s and 50s, when Jews began arriving on the North American shores, so what they discovered was that they were actually locked out of most opportunities. They weren't allowed in medical schools. They weren't allowed to own land in certain areas. They weren't allowed to go to law schools. So what did that generation of Jew do 50, 60 years ago in North America? They went to work and they figured it out. They opened up their own medical schools. They started their own hospitals. They started their own law practices. And many, many, many books and articles have been written on that generation, on the creativity, on the resourcefulness, on the tenacity of that generation who had nothing, was given no opportunity, what they did. And we all know, and this is a broad stroke stereotype, many of the children of that generation who worked so hard and tirelessly, who were behind the 8 ball their whole life, had children who were completely unmotivated and not interested, without any ambition, and basically were given everything that their parents worked so hard to be able to provide, and the children then took it and had no ambition to do anything with it. And this is not my novel idea. It's an example of when your back was up against a wall and you had no opportunities and there was nothing open to you, it forces the creativity and the resourcefulness that when the opportunity is sitting you in the face and you're not hungry and there's plenty of food in the refrigerator and there's nothing driving you to get a good job because I have everything that I need, though that generation, that second generation could have done that, could have produced, could have been resourceful and creative, but they didn't have that which forced it. Necessity is the mother of all invention. We know that. Golus represents the trials and tribulations that force us to become the people that we can become. If a person is motivated on their own, a person obviously can do that without it. Most of us need something to push us to actually become that which we can. Now, I don't refer to specific tragedies and traumas within a person's life where this also sometimes applies, but I don't want to get into that because it's a complicated concept. But just the idea of need of being in exile, not being home, not being comfortable, forces it. Another simple example, just to bring this idea out, is the modern state of Israel. It is well known throughout the world how absolutely fascinating it is that a country that's so young, 70 plus years, can have developed so quickly, can be on the top of agricultural technology, army and military technology. Like, how is that possible? The answer is they have to. They won't survive in the neighborhood that they're in with the neighbors that they have who want to see them destroyed. You must be cutting edge to make it. And you can read tons of books on this idea. It's not my idea. It's just another example of it. Now, again, that's a funny example of exile. They're actually at home, our homeland of the land of Israel. But the idea of this is not easy. I can't sit back and relax. I'm not home. I'm not comfortable. Forces out of us that which might not otherwise ever have been there. And it's part of the process. I want to show you two other midrashim that address this issue just in a fascinating way. A little bit later in our Parsha, the Torah describes in this week's Parsha how Moshe meets Hashem in the burning bush. He, after a week-long discussion, is finally convinced to take on this mission. And the Torah says, "Vayelech Moshe el Chosno." Moshe went to his father-in-law Yisro before returning to Mitzrayim. So the Medrash asks, why is he going to his father-in-law? So Heichan halach. What do you mean by Yelech Moshe? It's like just seemed like a strange thing. When he went to his father-in-law, I thought he was going down to Mitzrayim. So the Medrash says, "Shahalach li tol ishto uvanav." He went to take his wife and his children. Amar lo Yisro leheichan atam olichan. Yisro asks Moshe, where are you taking them? Where are you going with my daughter and my two grandchildren? Amar lo leMitzrayim. Moshe says, I'm going back to Mitzrayim. That's where I came from. I'm going back to Mitzrayim. Amar lo, Yisro says to him, Oisan shehem b'Mitzrayim mivakshin lotzes. The Jews who are stuck in Mitzrayim, all they want to do is get out of there. Ve'atmo lichan. And you're not going to bring my grandchildren there? They're all trying to get out. Amar lo, the Medrash says, L'mochar heinasidin latzeis v'lamod al har Sinai. Those people there now, subject to Mitzrayim, are going to get out and stand at Har Sinai, Lishmoya mipi HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Anoichi Hashem Elokecha, Asher Hotzeisicha me'eretz Mitzrayim. Hashem is going to begin the Aseret Sadibros Kabbalah Satorah. I took you out of Mitzrayim. And Moshe says, Ubanai lo yishma'u kmohem. My son shouldn't hear like that. They're just going to show up and they're going to hear, I am Hashem, but we weren't in Mitzrayim. It's not right, Moshe says. I have to take him. They have to be in Mitzrayim to experience that so that they can be taken out and stand with everybody else and receive the Torah. Now, Moshe is talked out of this. Rashi quotes a different medrash that says that Moshe had the same conversation with Aharon, that when Moshe shows up in Mitzrayim, he comes with the children, because we know that he does actually ignore Yisro's advice, because on the way down to Mitzrayim, we have the whole episode of the Bris Milah that he gives to his children. But then when he gets to Aaron, it's only he's by himself. So Rashi quotes in Parshas Yisro, where are the kids? So Rashi quotes the same conversation that he originally had brought them. And Aaron says, what are you doing with these guys? And Moshe says, what do you mean? They need to be part of the Shibut so that they could be freed. And Aaron says to him, listen, we're crying over all the children who are in Mitzrayim now. You can't bring more here. So Moshe sends them back. And eventually Yisro brings Tzipora and the two boys at Kabbalah Sator. What did Moshe want? Moshe wanted them to be part. Like they have to be part of that. There's something about that experience, which is what shapes us as a nation. And if you miss it, you missed it. And we do never hear from Moshe's two children. They're not mentioned anywhere in Chumash. Once they show up again at Kabbalah Satorah, they're a non-factor. Moshe dreams of them becoming leaders, but Hashem totally looks past, and their names are not even mentioned. They make no appearance anywhere out. On a personal level, this is just, when we think about what's going on in the land of Israel right now, it's being formed through the trials and tribulation. The Jewish people, the future of the Jewish people is being formed. We're all on the sidelines watching, and there's something real to that idea. The Israelis there now, we're going through this, and it's really nice that you guys are all comfortable in North America and supporting us, but you're not part of that which is taking place. There's something happening here. We're forming, we're shaping, we're taking Jews from the four corners of the world and figuring out how to live together. And it's not an easy process, and it hasn't happened right away, but we're figuring it out. And it's just, we're just watching it, but not part of it. And Moshe says, if they're not part of it, they're missing something. And it's part of the package. We find that also when Hashem gives this promise to Avram, he says, I'm not just going to give you the land. I'm going to give you the land in source 11. Yadoa teida ki ger yezaracha be'eretz lo lahem. Your children are going to be strangers in a land that's not theirs. V'avadum v'inus, they're going to be enslaved, and they'll be afflicted. And then I'll take them out. V'achrechen yetzu b'rechush gadol. There will be a rechush gadol. But first comes, this is our entire Pesach Seder, by the way. You cannot experience a Pesach Seder. You can't have just a freedom. if you didn't already experience the maror. And that's, we tell the story. We start, matchilin bignus, you have to start with the servitude, you have to start with the pain, you have to start with the suffering, and only then can you experience the freedom. It's part of it. This is what Esav didn't want. We mentioned this in a couple shiurim ago, that Esav says, why does he leave the land of Israel to settle in Seir mipnei Yaakov achiv? Rashi says, Esav said, listen, you can only live in this land if you're going to suffer the punishment. I'm not interested in suffering through that in order to be able to get there. So I'm leaving now. I want no part of the suffering, and I'll have no part of the land, but I'm not interested in going through what I would need in order to get this land. One last on that idea, the Gemara Masechah Shabbos, in the famous Gemara when Moshe goes up to receive the Torah, and the Malachim try to stop him. The Malachim say, how are you going to give the Torah to a human being? You should leave it up here. Much to discuss about that idea also, but not for our purposes tonight. So Hashem says to Moshe, give him an answer. How can I justify giving you the Torah and not leaving up here in Shemayim for the angels? So what's Moshe's response? So he says, Amar lefanav, Ribono shel olam, Torah she'atanoisin limoxin. What does it say in this Torah that you're giving us? Anochi Hashem Elokecha asher hotzeitzicha me'eretz Mitzrayim. I am Hashem who took you out of Mitzrayim. And Moshe says to the angels, L'Mitzrayim yiradatem. Did you go down to Mitzrayim? L'Paro hishtabadatem. Were you subjugated by Paro? Torah lama tehe lachem. Why should you have the Torah? Now, this is a fascinating answer. Moshe later is going to make arguments. He's going to say, do you have parents? So do you need kibbud avim? Do you do business? Do you need the laws of being truthful and honest? Do you give loans that you need the laws of interest? Do you wear tzitzis? All of those things are valid arguments. Why should you have the Torah that teaches you about these laws? But this argument, his first argument, he said, did you go down to Mitzrayim? Why do you need the Torah? You're not relevant. Torah matahelecha, what's it relevant to you? Who cares that they didn't go down to Mitzrayim? It is a relevant point, because part of the formation of who we become, the Eila Shmos B'nai Yisrael, this is the book of exile. And it's through the exile that we experience that's nizgala, that reveals, forces us out of our comfort zone to become the people that can receive the Torah on Har Sinai. We're shaped as Chazal in the Kur HaBarzel, in the iron furnace of Mitzrayim, in the difficulties there, gives the place to be formed into the people who will actually receive the Torah. Oh, I'm sorry, my sheets are flipping here. Okay. No, I need one more. There's one other source which I want to mention now. We're going to talk about it in other parashiyos. The Gemara Maseches Pesachim says an amazing line. The only reason why Hashem sent us into the exile, that we should have converts join us in all the different places in the world where we end up, and that part of the rechush gadol, the great wealth that we'll gain by being in exile, is all of the character traits and the abilities we'll pick up from many different nations of the world along the way. This is a much bigger discussion. We're going to reference it later. There'll be other times that the Rosh Yeshiva is going to talk about this idea, but it's relevant to one of the aspects of galus in which when you leave, you learn and pick up and add all of those holy souls that join the Jewish people while one's there. We'll get to that to Mirz Hashem another time. We'll talk more about that. Putting this all together, we started with a question. Why does the Torah open up Sefer Shmos with names of the children of Yaakov, which we know already? Rashi picked up on the Medrash that says, because we're like stars. We're not just a number, we're a name. And it's a love, Rashi says, a chiba that we have, that we're given that specific name, like a diamond, each and every one of value unto itself. The Ramban, we asked on Rashi, okay, that's a nice, beautiful idea. Why now? So the Ramban says, well, there's something that's happening now when we go down to Mitzrayim. As we go down to Mitzrayim, we're beginning Golus, we're beginning exile. And this, which is a component of world Jewish history, put into the second pasuk in Chumash, that in order for us to progress through history, there are 4 different exiles. Going through each one of those stages will get us closer to the Melech HaMashiach by learning what it is that we need to learn from each Golus and getting out of it. That idea of Golus is part of the formation of the Jewish people, which happens when we go down to Mitzrayim. So we start with the names to say, the Ramban explained, when they went down to Mitzrayim, That's when Golus began, and therefore we begin this book with their names. And this idea of the Golus was a necessary component of forming ourselves into the Jewish people. Rashi says, that's when we are told about the great chiba that Hashem loves us. Meaning, we asked on Rashi, but why now does Hashem count us with names? So when you add it to the Ramban, now is the perfect time to tell us how much he loves us, because we're beginning a difficult process called Galus. We're beginning exile. It's going to be hard, it's going to be painful, and it's going to be beyond words to experience. And but it's going to be a necessary component of becoming the people that we need to become. And as we go down, Rashi understands that's when Hashem says, I want you to know I love you. Like a father that rebukes the son and says, son, you need to become everything that you can become. If I let you grow wild, you're not going to become that. You need this. You need this. And it's with pain and a heavy heart that I have to do this, but it's for everyone's benefit. When Hashem sends us into the exile, he does it with names. He does it with Lahodia Chibasim, to let us know how beloved we are. And I conclude that thought with the most magnificent medrash that I found when I was putting together all the other midrashim on this very same pasuk that we've been addressing all night tonight. Ve'ela Shmos B'nai Yisrael, the names. Here are the names of the Jewish people. The medrash says, and it seems like an opposite, but you'll see how beautiful it ties in. Al Shem Geulas Yisrael Nizkaru. The name. Why do we start with their names? We know their names: Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda. It's for the sake of the redemption of the Jewish people are they named here. And then the Medrash goes through each one of the names as it's a reference to redemption, not exile. Reuven, Rora'isi, because I've seen your affliction, I'm going to take you out. Shimon, because Hashem heard our cries. Levi, that Hashem, by the burning bush, I'll be with you always. Milab, I'll be together with you. Yehuda, Shahodo, Kodesh Baruch Hu. We give thanks to Hashem. He's one after another, all the way down to Yosef. Al Shem She'asir HaKadosh Baruch Hu Lahosif V'Ligolas Yisrael, that Hashem will further redeem the Jewish people. Mimalchus HaRisha'ah Kishem Shegog Ol Osami Mitzrayim. Yosef, I'll add, just like when Rachel gives birth to Yosef, she says, Yosef li ben Achra, I should have another son. Yosef, Hashem will redeem us now in Mitzrayim, and he will redeem us from other exiles that we will be in. Yosef Hashem Shenis Yado V'Chol and all of that. What a magnificent medrash. The names, we start this book, a book of exile, with names. It's the book of leaving our homes. It's a book of the difficulties of Mitzrayim to be formed into the people that we need in order to receive the Torah. Rashi says, and it's specifically then that Hashem counts us by name to reflect the love that he has individualized elements of each and every person, and included in that name, which is given to us now as we go down into exile, is also a hint, yes, you're going down into exile, but I will not leave you there. I will take you out. I will redeem you. And the names that I give as you go down to Mitzrayim reflect you're coming back home. When the time is right and you've gone through the process that you need to go through, and you've been nizgala, revealed to people who you can become. The very same names that I list to begin the exile, as the Ramban says, are the names that reflect the love that Hashem has of us, and the name that reflects the eventual geula, the redemption that will take place. And all of that is wrapped up in these first two words of Ve'ela Shmos. Here are the names of the Jewish people going down to Mitzrayim as we begin a sefer with information that we already knew, but to hint at all of these wonderful ideas. We really just touched on some of this. There's really much more to say on the difficult concepts of Yisurin and difficulties and trials and tribulations and bringing out qualities and traits within us, but we will leave that. We'll leave that for now. Always a pleasure learning with you on a Thursday night. And I'll stay on for any questions or comments, but look forward to seeing you all Mirz Hashem next week. And as you all know, we'll be going virtual as the shul by Shabbos morning will be closed up again for the next couple of weeks. But have a wonderful Shabbos, everyone, and I'll stand for some questions.